Hello, I'm Bruce Conger, the narrator of Plowed Fields, and I'm here in our Atlanta studio with the novel's author, Jim Barber. Hello, Jim, and welcome. I'm excited to talk with you about how Plowed Fields came to be and your experiences writing it. It's an extraordinary story in so many ways.
Thanks, Bruce. I appreciate that and look forward to chatting with you about it. First of all, I want to say a huge thanks to you guys, you and then Alan, the producer, and express my appreciation for the tremendous job you guys have done narrating this story. You really brought it to life in a way that I never imagined, and it's just extraordinary, I think, the way you captured the story with your voice. It's a big book, and you've been spot on from start to finish.
Well, Plowed Fields is definitely a complex story with so many intriguing characters. You have heroes and villains and then some characters who have very specific roles to play. It's what I call a meaty book. Can you tell us how the story came to you?
Yeah, this story actually dates back to 1985, maybe 1986 too. I was a young reporter, newspaper reporter in Middle Georgia, and I had been covering this story involving a sheriff, a longtime sheriff of a county in Middle Georgia, and the guy had suffered a massive stroke that left him bedridden. And you had some people who wanted him removed from office, and then you had some people who wanted him to stay in office. And this guy had a history of trampling the civil rights of black citizens. Anyway, so you had this one group who truly hated him, this one group who loved him, and the story went on for, like I say, about 6 months, and finally a judge removed him from office. And I had written my last story about this, and I was driving home one day, and I was really caught up in this idea of people being so sure that they were right, but they were doing wrong in the process, and also this idea of people being caught up in circumstances beyond their control. And anyway, as I was driving along that day, the story just came to me. I mean, it was like watching something on TV. It just went right through my head, and I thought, I have got to write this down. And so I started the very next weekend. I outlined the story. I outlined the major characters, and that's how the book came to be.
As an author, you did a wonderful job of capturing a time and place in the 1960s in South Georgia. It's impossible to read the book and not get a good sense of what it was like to live on a South Georgia tobacco farm in the 1960s. I saw one review that said the pages of Plowed Fields drip with the sweat, grime, and grit of field work and the bone-tired stress of trying to make ends meet. You obviously know a little bit about what it's like to live on a tobacco farm.
I absolutely do. I grew up working on my uncle's tobacco farms, and I spent most of my youth from all the way to high school with those guys. And so I came to understand very much how tobacco farms work, and not just tobacco farms, farming in general, especially being from a rural community. It's interesting that the setting for this story to me came well after the story came to me. I told you how the story came to be a little bit earlier. I knew that it was supposed to be set on a farm somewhere, but it really wasn't until I had completed my first draft that I found the real setting for the story, which is the fictional town of Cookeville, Georgia. It's modeled closely after the county that I grew up in, Berrien County in South Georgia, and the county seat there is Nashville. I also set the Baker family on a farm that's really almost identical to the farm where my dad was raised, although the farm in the book is on steroids compared to the farm where we actually lived. Once I decided where to set the story, it became really important to me to make sure that I preserved a time and a place that I think is very special, which is that part of South Georgia in the 1960s. I did a lot of research to make sure that I captured the spirit of the time. I read newspapers. I interviewed my uncles, my dad, to make sure I got the details about the farming just right. That was really important to me to make sure that it felt authentic.
The story eventually carries the protagonist, Joe Baker, to Atlanta in 1970, and your depiction of the city in that time was spot on.
Yeah, Atlanta, from what I've heard, was something else in the early 1970s. Obviously, I was a little bit too young, but I had cousins and friends who visited in Atlanta during the early 1970s, and I made good use of their experiences to recreate that scene. Again, that sense of time and place has been a huge appeal of the book for many readers.
Speaking of time and place, Jim, some of the language in the book is harsh and would be considered unacceptable in today's world, specifically the use of the N-word when talking about black Americans. I have to tell you, it was very uncomfortable for me as the narrator using that word.
It was uncomfortable for me writing it.
I noticed in the book that one of the discussion questions was, how did the use of the N-word make you feel? And could the author, you, have found a better way to characterize the prejudice in the book?
That's an intriguing question, Bruce, and I've enjoyed talking with readers about that very thing. There's very little profanity in the book except where it felt absolutely necessary and true to the character. I try to avoid profanity in general. Likewise, I loathe the N-word. But for this story to have any value, the characters had to be true to their time, and regretfully, the N-word was used frequently in South Georgia during the 1960s. When you think about the character of Bobby Taylor, for instance, it's impossible to think of him using any other word in those cases. If you tried to whitewash the ugliness of those times, the story would be an utter failure, I think, and it would be such an injustice to real people who actually endured that kind of vitriol and hate during that era.
Something else that intrigued me about the book was the pacing. It starts out in a very wholesome way, very Americana. But as the decade progresses, it takes a darker turn into some very difficult and heart-wrenching moments.
That's a great observation. The pace of the book was very deliberate, from innocence to sin, from good to evil, despair to triumph. But that's kind of the decade of the 1960s, isn't it? I mean, life changed dramatically during the 60s. You had this decade that started with all this great optimism, and then it ended with tremendous disillusion. I think the book reflects that.
There's a lot of similarities between Joe Baker, the main character, and your own personal background. You both have roots on a South Georgia tobacco farm, and you both pursued newspaper careers. Is this story a little bit autobiographical?
That's a fair question, and I've been asked that one a few times. I don't think you can really write a book without putting something of yourself in it. At least I can't. But no, Joe Baker and Jim Barber are very different people. First off, he's a lot older than me, 16 years older, in fact, so his life experiences were very different than mine. In some ways, he may be my alter ego, a person that I wish that I could have been, minus his mistakes that he makes along the way. But Joe's Joe and Jim's Jim, and we're certainly not one and the same.
Jim, what do you want people to take away from this book?
Basically, I want them to walk away feeling as if they've been entertained and that it was worth their investment of the time required to read it. I would also hope that they would come away with a true sense of the time and place they read about in the book. But if you're looking for a deeper answer, then I would have to say that I hope that I've written a novel that readers want to and can live in. I know that sounds kind of strange, but I hope that people feel like they're part of the story in some way. Several people have told me that parts of the story left them rattled and shaken. Basically, it's this whole notion of when bad things happen to good people. One of my guiding thoughts, not front and center by any means, but somewhere in my thinking, was to create a story that would challenge your faith in a very real way. This is not Christian fiction by any stretch of the imagination, but I do believe the story is very much a faith journey in many ways. Faith, and by that I mean faith in God, faith in others, faith in ourselves. Sometimes that faith comes across in very blatant ways in the book. Usually it's hovering somewhere in the background. Anyway, I hope my readers will shine the light on it from time to time and consider their own faith in light of what's happening to the characters in the book.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. Boy, I am certainly very much interested in Book 2 and Book 3 because it's very riveting so far. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Bruce. I appreciate it.
The end.